Hello, my name is Caitlin Presnell, and today I will be briefing you on my research paper for this semester, which had the question of, compared to other states in the region that had uprisings as well, why did the Arab Spring affect Yemen, Syria, and Libya the most? To begin, I wanted to state my thesis statement, which is that the Arab Spring affected Yemen and Libya and Syria as well, more so than other states in the region that were involved in the uprisings due to the involvement of foreign proxies in its civil war. I only stated Yemen because it has a more prominent proxy war compared to the other two states that had Arab uprisings and civil wars as well. So a bit of a background, the Arab Spring began in December of 2010 when protests in Tunisia ended the president's 20-year heavy-handed rule. This was called the Jasmine Revolution that was started by Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a street vendor that protested the seizure of his vegetable stand by police within the streets of Tunisia. This created a catalyst for the revolution that spread throughout the Middle East and North Africa and eventually ended up in Libya, Syria, and Yemen that created civil wars that are still somewhat going on today. In Libya, the state fell into civil war after the downfall of their authoritarian dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, where two opposing governments eventually took control and ruled autonomously within the state. This led to a lot of suffering in the civilian population due to violence in the streets, limited access to resources, and the refugee crisis. Syria also faced a refugee crisis that was pretty bad after they couldn't force out Bashar al-Assad, their current president, out of the country. He is, of course, an authoritarian dictator within the country and still rules today. ISIS, of course, was also very prominent in the state, whereas they declared a caliphate in northeastern Syria after they moved in and took a huge presence in the country. Today, ISIS doesn't have much traction as they have been forced out by the Kurds. In Yemen, there was a revolt against former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, where they decided to transition to current President Abdullah Mansour Hadi in an effort to stamp down these revolts. This led to the creation of separatist movements like the Southern Transitional Council and Ansar Allah, which are better known as the Houthi rebels. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is also a prominent figure within the war as they control a lot of territory within Yemen. So my method of research through this paper was to begin by operationalizing some important words, such as the effects of the Arab Spring. I decided to measure this through political turbulence, economic difficulties, social deterioration, and conflict that was felt after the uprisings in 2011. Of course, that's where my time frame begins. Foreign proxy is another one that I operationalized as a state or non-state actor that is authorized to represent another in a conflict. Civil war, of course, is a war between organized groups within the same state or country, and a proxy war is an armed conflict between states or non-state actors which act on the instigation or representation of other parties. As the involvement of foreign proxies in post-Arab Spring civil war rises, the negative effects flowing from the Arab Spring will continue to rise as well. This is positively related, and this is, of course, my hypothesis that I used for this entire research paper. I decided to take a case study approach where I studied Tunisia as a control, since this is the state that had a successful political transition, and then Libya and Syria and Yemen as states where civil war did break out after the uprisings occurred. So for my findings, I found that Tunisia changed their political system from authoritarian to a parliamentary republic where they currently have a president in place over the state. After this transition happened, there was hundreds of political party participation in the state, and they received a lot of support from the United States for democratic consolidation and private sector employment through this agreement that I have on this slide. Overall, during the revolts, there were around 300 civilians killed as a result. In Yemen, the government is currently in transition, and the government that doesn't have full control over the state is led by the General People's Congress. And the Houthi rebels have their own government political system, which is the National Salvation Government Party. Al-Qaeda, of course, also leads controlled areas through Islamic State. You can see all this in the map I attached that shows that the Yemeni government does not have full control of the state of Yemen today. There was also a lot of foreign involvement during this war that is still going on. As you can see, there was at least 90 unlawful coalition airstrikes with U.S. origin munitions by the coalition. There's lots of airstrikes as well by the Houthi rebels that have Iranian origin munitions. Saudi-led coalition, which is a coalition of states in the Middle East and Africa that include the UAE, of course, that is supported by the United States and other countries throughout Europe. They back the Yemeni government, and then Iran participates in the war by backing the Houthi rebels. The United States has pushed aid into the country due to the damage that has been caused by the war, and there are currently 19 million people in need of aid and more than 17 million people at risk of starvation. Yemen currently has the worst humanitarian crisis in the world due to this war, and at least 233,000 Yemenis have been killed overall. In Libya, I found that the government is in transition as the country is driven by state and non-state entities, and that they have had foreign involvement from NATO, this is at the beginning of the war, through the use of precision-guided bombs and airstrikes. They've had a number of countries play roles within the war, which has led to a high death rate, but I did not place this within my paper or PowerPoint as there was a media clamp placed by authorities at the beginning of the war, so there are very inaccurate numbers that did not match up well enough for me to feel comfortable saying that these were accurate. In Syria, the government is a presidential republic with a highly authoritarian regime where Bashar al-Assad still remains in power. The Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party is the dominant political institution, and the United States has provided more than $7.7 billion in aid since 2011. There's been a lot of foreign involvement through chemical weapons attacks, IEDs, excessive force, and air campaigns, as you can see in Libya and Yemen. More than 400,000 civilians have died, and 5 million have sought out refuge from this war. So my alternative explanation is that potentially compared to foreign proxies, economic or social issues could have been a cause factor that pushed these into civil wars from the revolts that they started as. Yemen and Syria are the reason of this because they are the poorest countries within the Middle Eastern region, and they have been and continue to be today. If economics were more important within this discussion, it would create a clear conversation as to why Yemen and Syria were so heavily affected. The next one was the authoritarian governmental reach that was too far in most of these states. You could see this in Syria as the government was not overthrown after the revolts began. So my conclusion to explain my significant implications of research in this paper is that compared to Tunisia, Yemen, Syria, and Libya failed to transition political systems, faced violent foreign intervention, and were all considered to be failed states within the Middle East. Foreign proxies became involved in these wars in an effort to block adversarial state and non-state actors from furthering their regional influence. This is seen prominently within Yemen, as Iran has attempted to further their influence within the state through the support of the Houthi rebels. The ongoing wars have been prolonged by the involvement of foreign proxies. You can see a spelled out list right here of all countries that have been involved in these wars. And the involvement has led to high death rates and high rates of air campaigns. So my final bluff of this paper that I wanted to get across is that after foreign proxies became involved in the wars that were transitioned after the Arab Spring created revolts within these three states, effects were worsened due to their intervention and the air campaigns and intervention that they put within the country. It was clear that the involvement of foreign proxies extended and complicated most of these wars, specifically the wars in Yemen, Syria, and Libya, and were a major causal factor as to why the effects were so felt in these three countries compared to other states like Tunisia. Here is my works cited, and I thank you for listening.